Chapter 3: Early Colonization, the Mongols as Privileged People. It has already been pointed out that the plain between Hyeongan Wall and Willow Palisade is a region which geographically favors contact and cultural exchange between pastoral and agricultural communities, provided that the social and political conditions are also favorable. The spirit of agriculture into this region and the foundation of cities had intermittently been promoted in the past by the existence of barbarian empires based on the frontier, which exercised their power over China. The Liao Empire and Jing Empire, which have already been mentioned, are good examples, but the same phenomenon had been known in much earlier times. Now, the character of colonization and the spirit of Chinese civilization in such period needs to be correctly understood. It doesn't mean a merging of barbarian and Chinese with a consequent infusion of urbanity in the barbarian and the virility into Chinese, followed by an outward surge of civilization of Chinese colonists into a raw barbarian lands at least not at first. It means, on the contrary, that when a barbarian people successfully invades China, it divides into two classes. An administrating, controlling, garrisoning body moves into the conquered Chinese territory, but main body remains behind in the original barbarian territory, because this barbarian territory has always been essential to dominion over China, and therefore can't be abandoned, for fear that another barbarian people will break in through it and challenge the newly founded power in China. Since, however, barbarians who move into China at once became a privileged class, enjoying all kinds of new luxuries, barbarians who remain behind also feel entitled to luxuries. They therefore build little, provincial, half-barbarous imitations of luxury cities of China, and import a servile class of artisans to build the site in cities, traders to bring them goods of China, and a servile, or at least dependent class of farmers to feed cities, artisans, and the traders. Initial spread of the city building and agriculture of Chinese type into the region north of the Great Wall controlled by barbarians is therefore the normal historical cycle, a phenomenon of self-indulgence on the part of barbarians and of parasitic dependence on a part of the Chinese. There is, however, a secondary tendency among those of barbarians who are in touch with the luxury cities and artificial agriculture to be affected by the easier, more comfortable standards of life which they represent. It is almost impossible for outside observers, whether Chinese or Western, who can't appreciate a very deep and genuine pride of the barbarians in being a barbarian, to understand that this form of barbarian point of view doesn't necessarily mean progress or civilization, or attitude is inevitably biased by use of the term barbarian for the nomad and civilized men for peasants, artisans, and townsmen. The barbarian, however, is not to himself a barbarian. He is a free man, a strong man, the man who takes and who rules. From the barbarian point of view, civilized Chinese throughout the history has been the dependent man, weak man, man who has things taken from him and who is ruled. To become dependent on the comforts of agriculture and towns is, according to barbarian tradition, to degenerate. In the vocabulary of the people like Mongols to this day, the term hard is used to Mongols and the term soft of Chinese. These terms don't stand only the physical robustness, but for the moral hardness of the man who lives in the saddle and makes his camp where he pleases, as against the moral softness of the man who is in bondage to the land he tills or the merchandise in which he deals, to his goods and his comforts, the safety of his roof and his walled towns. There can be no doubt that these characteristics are historically important. Mongol herdsman looks down on Mongol farmer, even among the Manchus, whose assimilation to the Chinese is usually regarded as a complete. Men of the border older Manchu villages in the Manchuria, though they have quite lost their Manchu speech, tend to claim that they are harder and purer than the city Manchu of Peking, and to claim a moral superiority, even though they somehow grudgingly admit and admire superior sophistication of the city Manchu. Historically, the periods which we regularly treat as periods in which the barbarians are civilized by the conquered become quite different if we realize that they were periods in which barbarians consciously indulged themselves in the morally questionable case of civilization. The psychological characteristics of such periods is that of the athlete who breaks training with the feeling that he can always at some future time work off the effects of easy living and return to form. It is only after 2 or 3 generations that barbarians find they have lost their grip on their old form and themselves become subservient to the civilization which they had begun by exploiting. At this point, there is a genuine turn in frontier relations. Barbarians have become a class of Chinese. They no longer control China from a frontier, but are forced from their position within China to prop up the frontier as best they can from within, lest they be themselves conquered by the fresh invasion from beyond the frontier. In this new phase, Chinese who has moved beyond the frontier takes on a new character. Originally a dependent who has become genuinely rooted in the region, in one sense he represents the spirit of civilization. In another, he has taken on the original feeling of the frontier. He has become primarily a frontiersman, and consequently, so long as the control power in China continues to function strongly, he will continue to push outward. But when it begins to weaken and the rise of the new frontier power is at hand, he will either fall back into China, abandoning the frontier altogether, or identify himself in a quasi-tribal manner with the new frontier power that is beginning to press inward on China. Most recent historical illustration of this process is Manchu assumption of control within the old Chinese Pale in southern Manchuria, which is followed by the first place by a wave of defeatist Chinese Manchurians migrating into China, and the second place by the formation of the Chinese group within the regional power which Manchus created. These were Chinese bondmen who served with the Manchus in the conquest of China. The initial hesitancy of the aliens among them is best illustrated by the history of Wu Sangui, the Chinese commander at the Great Wall who admitted the Manchus after the negotiation so that their final march on Peking might well be called an intervention in the civil wars of China rather than an invasion. The decision of Wu Sangui is easily construed as a desperate effort to save China, where Chinese rebels from Shenxi province had desecrated the tombs of Ming emperors and taken Peking, and the last ruler of Ming dynasty had hanged himself on as they broke into the Forbidden City. Wu Sangui then came to the terms with Manchus, although his father was a hostage in the hands of the rebels, and with the Manchus marched on Peking to destroy usurpers. While incident, however, can be very differently interpreted if it be remembered that Wu Sangui was a native of Chinese Pale in southernmost Manchuria. He must, considering his rank and importance, have had both personal interests in Manchuria and personal connections among Chinese Manchurians already serving with the Manchus. The decision which he made must have been a decision between playing his own hand in China or taking place to which his Manchurian affiliation entitled him in the regional coalition of Manchus, Mongols, and Manchurian Chinese. His later career indicates that he may even have hoped to displace the Manchus eventually as a leading power within the coalition. Manchus, at any rate, insured themselves against such a possibility, for while they continued Wu Sangui in the power and honor, they kept him away from the Great Wall frontier. And in the end, finding himself joked out of the position and unable to play the kingmaker, he turned against the Manchus and died a rebel. This, then, were the forces at work in Manchurian region, as between Manchus, Mongols, and Chinese at the time when the composite racial and regional power of Manchuria was about to break the Great Wall and set up new empire in China. The Mongol princes of the region, owing their early alliance with the Manchus, had been giving many Manchu princesses in the marriage. And this kind of personal relation between princely families of the Manchurian Mongols and the Manchu imperial house was to continue important in the later years. The prince of Manchurian Mongols therefore tended increasingly to take a Manchu and dynastic rather than the Mongols and tribal point of view. They formed a powerful regional group, intermediary between Manchus and the outlying Mongols, and they aspired inevitably to the same kind of the careers and position that appealed to rich and highly born Manchus. They began to patronize agriculture because of the fixed type of revenue it brought in and because it made possible for them as an upper class of the Mongol constituency within the Manchurian regional coalition, an approximation to the amenities of civilization which conquering Manchus had themselves very early began to consider a social necessity. Manchu high policy discouraged such tendencies, especially while Manchus retained the impetus of their first ascendancy. Even in 1635, before the actual conquest of China, Emperor rebuked his court for tendency to ape the Chinese, referring them for a warning to the example of decline of Jin dynasty of New Zheng Tatars, a clear case of the old moral distrust of civilization. It soon proved impossible to keep Manchus who entered China from luxuriating in civilization. Moreover, it was desirable in order to win the respect of Chinese that Manchus, the upper class at any rate, should endeavor to reach the standard of Chinese in a scholarship. Although Chinese always looked with warrantable suspicion on the literary degrees awarded by a system of favoritism to Manchu soldiers. An effort was made, however, to keep Manchus left in Manchuria from being contaminated. In the later years of the dynasty, colonies of the Peking Manchus were actually moved to Manchuria in the futile effort to renew their racial and regional spirits and to check increase of the hanger-on class in Peking. No degrees of possibly could halt an inevitably historical process among the Manchus, but an intelligently organized frontier policy did slow down the spread of civilization among Mongols very considerably. If Mongols could be held their old tribal organization and culture, then Manchus, by retaining as much as possible of their own frontier character, while at the same time taking on something on the civilized character of Chinese, could hope to stand between Mongols and Chinese and control both. Their stance in China and the Chinese Pale of Manchuria gave them a resource of an old and rich civilization, while from Mongols they could draw troops that were at once first class, fighting men and unsophisticated in politics. It was necessary therefore to protect tribal characters of Mongols, but at the same time to interfere with tribal process in such a manner as to prevent formation of the major tribal grouping among them, and especially prevent emergence of any tribal leadership which might add political direction to their obvious but uncoordinated racial and national unity. Mongol princes and nobles were therefore barred from political and civil careers within China and restricted to military and administrative careers within their own regions of frontier. They were given important honors and subsidies, but if careers of any Mongol prince too creative and his power among Mongols too constructive, he was promoted to some supervisory position in Peking, which kept him in contact with court and away from the main current of tribal affairs. His heirs grew up with the social ideas of Peking Manchus, and growth of coordination among Mongols was inhibited. Even this policy, however, couldn't truly prevent the spread of civilization along actual border between where Chinese and Mongols met, and especially in Mongol territories of Manchuria. While Manchus in Peking became Chinese, and Manchus remaining in Manchuria tended to become identical in culture and regional interest with the Chinese of the Chinese Pale, and Manchurian Mongols tended to become what Manchus themselves had originally been, a people half tribal and half agricultural in character. Chinese colonization, as has been pointed out, was in the beginning a luxury which Mongols themselves introduced, but there was also an early tendency for Mongol tribesmen to settle down. It is probable that there was a good deal of agriculture among Harchens of the Dostlik and Jehe even before the conquest of 1644, as there was also among the Suyu and Tumits for farther to the west, and among Tumits who had before conquest migrated from Suyuan region to territory of Dostlik. The beginning of the agriculture had also appeared along Willow Palisade on the traditional border between Mongols and Chinese Pale. No one who has been enough among both settled and nomadic Mongols to appreciate their instinctive feelings, and who has been actual process of transformation when pastoral Mongols take up agriculture, can possibly doubt that Mongol agriculture at such a period must have begun among the dependent classes, hangers on the greater man, Mongol of wealth, for family might settle down in to live of the rentals of land cultivated Chinese, but Mongol who actually began to work on the land was the man of no particular standing among his own people, the man who after long years of garrison service or the attendance on his prince had lost touch with the tribal life or become dependent on the life of the houses and the streets and in the undeviating, unenterprising routine of the civilization. Mongol farming, in other words, was not an early period of occupation of ambitious men any more than it is now. The Mongol who settled down didn't do so because he felt it was a setup in civilization. He was resigned to it as a makeshift. In the same way, at present time, the successful Mongol is a man of tents and herds. If Mongol settles down, it is because he has been crowded by Chinese colonization until there is no room for his herds. Nothing that he gains can compensate him for feeling of loss. It is because he has been forced to descend to Chinese level of living that he so passionately resents the way in which Chinese looks down on him as a barbarian. He wants always claim that he is just as good a Mongol as herdsman, but feels always that he is neither as a good Mongol nor as a good a man. The first period, both Chinese colonization among the Manchurian Mongols and Mongol agriculture ran from before conquest of 1644 to the year 1748. The Manchus in this period had two main problems. They had to restore economic stability within China, which had been shattered by the disorders in the last years of Ming Dynasty, and they had to maintain and extend their military control along the Great Wall frontier. They needed Mongol military contingents while completing their administrative control of China. But they needed also complete their administrative control in Mongolia. The western and northern Mongols hadn't yet come over to the Trans-Frontier Coalition, and Manchus especially feared that the Western Mongols might create an independent military power capable of changing their own. During these years, Manchus worked hard at colonization within China itself, bringing back into cultivation of acreage that had been laid waste in the civil wars under the Ming. Lands along the Great Wall just to the north of the northwest of Peking were largely allotted to the followers of Manchu conquest. This put a screen along the Great Wall, ensuring that the Mongol sector along the edge of the frontier should actually be controlled by Manchus rather than Mongols. It is probable also that the Manchus, while following the principle of policy of keeping Mongols tribal, did not in this period object to that like softening of their own Mongol allies. Agriculture spread further among the southern Mongol tribes of Jiehe, and there was an important increase of Chinese tenant farming among the Mongols of Jirim Lake in Fengtian and Qing province. This immigration must not be confused with the encroachment of later periods. It was, as can be understood from what has already been said, promoted by Mongols themselves. The second period can be dated from 1738 by the reign of Qianlong. The constructive period in the formation of Manchu Empire was rounded out. The Great Wars had been fought and great problems of organization dealt with. The menace of the independent Mongol Empire had faded with the decline of old or Western Mongols. This great branch of Mongols, with tribes extending from the Altai region of Outer Mongolia across Chinese Turkestan into Huknor region of the Tibet, had very nearly destroyed of the balance of Great Wall frontier. It was by supporting Khalkhas of Outer Mongolia against Olds that Manchus extended their authority into Outer Mongolia, and thereafter, by the supporting one old faction against another, they completed their expansion by gaining control of Chinese Turkestan. In 1750, making use of the both Central Asian Turkish and Mongol allies, they defeated by ruling tribal group among the Olds. In 1770, they persuaded a large number of Olds who, because of disagreement with the dominant group, had migrated into Russia as far as the Volga to return to northern Chinese Turkestan. Having created tribal balance in Western Mongolia and Central Asia favorable to Owen dynasty, the chief concerns of government thenceforth for Manchus was to maintain regional and administrative balance. For Manchus, ruling an empire founded on the power of the frontier, only one conception of stability was possible: the frontier as a region and as a political conception must be held in reserve in order to guarantee power over the empire as a whole, while China was to be administered as an exploitable part of empire. Frontier, therefore, as a word apart, must be kept in a state of poise. It must not be allowed to decline, but it must not be allowed to allow a tribal political growth of its own, nor must it be allowed to bear down increasingly on China, because that would have started a new cycle of wars of conquest. Nor must China proper be allowed to expand into the frontier zone, because that would have destroyed the differentiation between conquerors and conquered, which kept Manchus in a place as rulers of China. From this turning point between the period of constructions and the period of attempted stabilization, and specifically from the year 1738, Manchu policy toward the Mongols hardened in theory, although it didn't grow more efficiently in practice. The failure in practice was not due to Manchus, but the Mongols themselves. The Manchu intention was to preserve Mongol character of the Mongols, especially the Manchurian Mongols. But it failed because Mongols, taking their ease as descendants of conquerors associated with the Manchus, insisted on living in a scale comparable with that of the Manchus. From the conflict between Manchu policy and Mongol willingness to let things slide, there arose in the important developments in the theory of sovereignty in Mongol territory, which can be dated in the year 1738. Basis of Mongol land tenure is that all land belongs to all tribe, even the prince having no prescriptive right. This may undoubtedly be traced and underlying primitive concepts of sovereignty, possibly obtaining among the other nomadic peoples besides the Mongols, in which land has no place at all. The important entity is the tribe itself, not a territory of tribe. So long as the tribe holds together, it is a power. Territory doesn't matter, and as a tribe could, in classical period of Mongol history, increase its power by moving from one territory to another, no disgrace attached to abandonment of territory. It is also evident that the king's tradition must have something to do with the enduring Mongol distrust of the settled economy. The man who is free to move has power, and the Mongol, because of the force of his history, doesn't like to be tied to a piece of land. Thus, it will be found all through the Mongol history that even a tribe is not so real in a thing as a genealogy of princely family, because princely descent, being descent from a great chief, is an obvious nucleus, one which to found a tribe. This is all the more true in that all princely genealogies since the 13th century are traceable to the house of Chinggis. The tribe itself, in altered conditions of Mongol history, might lose its name and identity by changing its allegiance from one prince to another, or prince might found a new tribe by gathering up followers from many different tribes. In all this, land had no part. Manchu policy succeeded, however, in establishing a degree of identification as between tribe and land, in putting an end to a characteristic Mongol process of creating tribes, breaking them up, and forming them afresh, process out of which rose great leaders and great conquests of Manchus, relied strongly on the assignment of defined frontiers to each tribe, or rather to each tribal unit ruled by a prince. For some tribes were subdivided among the several princes. This in turn tended to create a new form of principality, superseding the true Mongol concept of tribal following, which might be associated with a region in a general sort of way but had no territorial identity. While this process was never fully completed, so that even today Mongol principality is not a petty state in the Western sense, it did have an important effect on tribal unit and on political character of ruling prince. Not only do all tribal boundaries of the present day derive from the comparatively modern time of Manchus, but functions of the prince are also largely of Manchu creation. The Manchus laid great emphasis on the boundaries which they had created, and while Mongol prince was virtually autonomous within his own frontier, the offense of the leading his tribal following across their frontiers was one of the few acts which were likely to bring direct imperial intervention. The Manchus of necessity worked largely through the princes in their relations with Mongols, and this had an effect of kind familiar to other suzerain power, to British in India, for example. It placed a false emphasis on the certain elements in the native system, which under the free play of native forces would never have had the same importance. Mongol prince or chief was by origin a leader whose power depended primarily on his ability to lead successfully. Under the Manchus, he became petty sovereign, at once restrained and supported by an overlord. The unnatural fixation of the powers, prerogatives, and functions of Mongol prince thus brought about was to have devastating rule later. The rapidity of throughoutness of the revolution of Outer Mongolia, for instance, was primarily due to the fact that the position of the prince was artificial. They were unable to resume rapidly enough their true function as a leader of their people, and as this made them inevitable to reactionary and negative social group in instinctive struggle of Mongols to adapt themselves to a new condition they had of necessity. to give way before new social form. The most important legal development in the 18th century, however, was the prince was made responsible for the control of Chinese colonization and the Mongol agriculture allotment within his territory. This ruling unquestionably designed in the first place to conserve the Mongol character of the Mongols, to prevent the spread of the Chinese population and Chinese ideas, to stop Chinese colonization and check spread of agriculture among the Mongols themselves, was later to be cited. For the ironical purpose of assisting Chinese encroachment in Mongol territory, it is affected the 18th century. However, since the Mongols were largely in the favor of type of Chinese penetration, then at the work was merely to develop the regular procedure in the evasion of the law. Chiefly it would seem by granting the arranging exception to the standard prohibitions. During the second period, characterized by Mongol evasion of Manchu policy, Chinese penetration was of two kinds. In southeastern Jekhe, in the territories of Harcheng and Tumut of Zostlik, Mongols mortgaged land to Chinese for a term of years in return for cash advances. Chinese were supposed to repay themselves by farming the land and return the land to the Mongols at the end of the mortgage period. This in itself is evidence that the great part of the land must have passed already from the original tribal form of Mongol ownership into the private ownership of individual Mongols, which again indicates that agriculture had become established among Mongols. The reference in the Daqing Huitian indicates that the Chinese first appeared in this region as extra farm hands hired by land-owned Mongols in the sowing and harvesting seasons. The situation in this part of Jekhe was therefore parallel to that the Chinese Pale of Manchuria and in the Manchu region of Giri. In all these regions, there is a short growing season, and the sowing, cultivating, harvesting are all done by primitive hands methods. A great deal of work has to be done in the limited time, which results in seasonal demands for extra workers. The long idle season between the harvest and the next sowing gave time, even the age of before rail transport was developed, for Chinese to reach Manchuria, work for 3 or 4 months, and return their homes for the winter. The need for this extra labor supply was always recognized, in spite of the ordinance against the free Chinese immigration, and an attempt was made to meet the situation by admitting men who came without their women and families under a passport system. In southern Jekhe, as in Manchuria, labor passports were issued and number of passports issued each year was limited in order to prevent abuse of system. The probable effect of these regulations was to put up the price of labor and to encourage Mongols to evade regulations by retaining their hired labor permanently. The mortgaging of land to Chinese may have served in the part as a blind to cover this practice. Chinese being given a small piece of the land to work for himself and thus being available to do extra work for Mongol landlords. Chinese therefore didn't colonize on the large grants of land vacated for them by Mongols, but interpenetrated the Mongol agricultural communities as settlers and smallholders. This is proved by the record of an effort to clear up the situation by exchanging lands in order to form separate Mongol and Chinese communities, an effort which quite evidently failed. The records bear out the other indications that by 1738, while a part of these Mongol lands remained under the normal form of tribal ownership, the individual ownership of farm by Mongols was already well established. The social results were the several kinds. In the first place, a number of Mongols degenerated from being a leisured class into the landless class, throughout being underlived and outbought by Chinese who had first been their tenants under the mortgage system, so that there was a steady transfer of smaller holdings from the Mongols to Chinese. In second place, many of Chinese having come in without women of their own became Mongols. They took Mongol wives and eventually succeeded in being listed on the records as members of Mongol tribe. This probably was done in order to escape restrictions imposed on Chinese in Mongol territory and may often have been arranged through the bribing Mongol officials in order to facilitate the acquisition of land. The mortgage system in itself is an indication that there were difficulties in selling lands outright to Chinese. This particular phenomenon was more common among Harching Mongols than in any other regions, and it is said by the Harching Mongols themselves that in the modern period of increased pressure on the Mongols when it had become an advantage to be Chinese rather than Mongols, these families often took the lead in becoming Chinese. In the third place, comparatively powerful class of Mongol capitalists were developed, among whom aristocracy were prominent, together with the clergy, lama monasteries, that is, it is regarded as a land-owning corporations. These owners of large estates, by the advantage of their greater initial wealth, their strong social position, and their relatively great influence they had in controlling tribal lands that hadn't yet passed into the private ownership, actually improved their position as the rich landlords with both Mongols and Chinese tenants and laborers. The fact that Manchu policies at this period were genuinely directed toward the protection of Mongols is provided by reference in the Da Qinghui. A decree was issued enjoining Chinese in Jiehe to relinquish their mortgage after a term of years, to be determined in each case by value of holding, in order to force out as many Chinese as possible and discourage further immigration. The aristocracy and lamas were at the same time directed to distribute 1/3 of their holdings to poor Mongols to be farmed, a wording which proves again that the situation was not one of which Chinese agriculture had encouraged on the pastures of Mongols, but one in which agricultural Mongols had lost possession of their lands to their Chinese tenants through the mortgage system. The failure of all these Manchu attempts to keep Mongol organization healthy, moreover, proves that it was Mongols themselves, or privileged class among them, that were chiefly responsible for encouragement of Chinese immigration. The second important area of Chinese penetration in this period was farther north, especially among the cordless Mongols in the extreme northeastern angle of Jimlik, in the territory that is now part of the province of Heilongjiang and Gying, but a certain extent also among the Horchung Mongols of Samlik, in territory that is now part of Funtian province. The region of the Chanchung, now capital of the Manchukuo, under the name of Xinqing, may be taken as a focus of activity. The method of transferring land differed from that to southern Jiehe, as a Mongol agriculture was unimportant, and consequently there was a little or no transfer by the mortgage from individual Mongol holders to individual Chinese tenants. Colonization was a public enterprise. Tracts of tribal lands were turned over the long lease or on perpetual lease to communities of Chinese. Under the terms of this practice, the heads of Chinese communities dealt with the authorities of Mongol tribes. The income from the land rentals was a tribal fund and was divided among the ruling prince, officials, and tribe as a whole. Naturally, however, it was privileged class among the Mongols who had handling of the funds, who profited most, and it was their financial interest which prompted the encouragement of colonization in spite of the Manchu disapproval, and developed it beyond the point of furnishing easy money until it threatened the whole economic and social position of Mongols. Chinese civilization as a source of the profit for Mongols upper class was paralleled by other activities which made it easy to evade Manchu regulations. The region first affected near Changchun was point of the departure for Manchu expansion and tribal control of northeastern Manchuria, and especially for the strategic route from Gying up to the Nonni Valley and Amur. Manchus themselves were forced to introduce agricultural colonies at a certain point in order to provide supplies for their garrisons and for troops moving between central Manchuria to Nonni and Amur. Other tracts were brought under cultivation to provide grain reserves to Mongols themselves. In years of drought, official granaries were maintained with a stated reserve of grain for each tribal unit. This apparently originated as a benevolent measure for the protection of Mongol allies of Manchus. The granary system spread from the agricultural Mongols of Dostlik to Zootlik, then Jirimlik, then to Jirimlik, and later to other Mongol territories. In Jirimlik, Mongols themselves appeared to have begun the system building up the grain reserves and to have important agricultural Mongols from Dostlik for the purpose. Later, Manchu government backed up the system, probably as one of the competition for military contingents which Mongols furnished, and in order to provide supplies both for the troops and for their families whenever the Mongol contingents were called out. It was natural, however, as they grew accustomed to the position of privileged, subsidized people, that Mongols should consider themselves entitled to have colonies of the Chinese working for them, rather than farm the land themselves. This kind of demand among the Mongols, aided by the proximity of official colonies, made it easy to evade Manchu regulations in extending the area under cultivation. As for the spread of Mongol agriculture in Jirimlik, these too differed from the agriculture of Harchens and Tumutsoftos. Although the little had existed even before the conquest of China, later spread was due to assimilation to standards of Chinese immigrants. Groups of Mongols tended to become islanded between tracts turned over the Chinese and gradually settled down to farming in the Chinese manner. As however, these Mongols were not closely interpreted by the Chinese, as were the Mongols in Jekhe. The tracts farmed by Mongols remained distinct from those held by Chinese colonists. Mongol villages were solidly Mongol, and with no resident Chinese farmers and only a few Chinese laborers in the busy season. Among the easternmost Korlos Mongols who were in contact with Manchus of Gying, there was a tendency for these agricultural communities to lose their language and become completely Chinese in character. This was because Mongols tended to model themselves on the Manchus, and as Manchus became assimilated to the Chinese, so did Mongols. Farther south, among the Horchens, there was less Manchu influence, and Mongols were in direct contact with Chinese of the Chinese. Here, traditional antagonism between Mongols and Chinese was more effective, and Mongol farming villages, even those surrounded by Chinese communities, retained their language and national character with really extraordinary tenacity. It is thus possible to find within the 80 or 100 miles of Mukden, even at present day, Mongol villages where people have lived for generations in Chinese manner and yet still preserve Mongol language, although of course most of them, men especially, speak Chinese as well. It is now possible to assess the general character of this period in colonization, which may be called in the period of Manchu disapproval and Mongol toleration, extending from about 1738 until about the end of the 19th century. It is quite plain that Manchu policy of restriction was ineffective. There are repeated references to the concern felt by a Manchu government. The settled lands would be surveyed at the intervals and orders given that no further colonization would be allowed, but after a few years it would be found that there had in fact been a further extension of settlement because Mongols not contented with the nomadic life get Chinese to cultivate for them. This has been going on for years and they have lived at peace with each other for a long time. Moreover, Mongols get our benefit to them economically. A certain number of Mongols fell to the position of cultivators, and a certain number, notably in Jehe, were pauperized by competition of lower Chinese standard of living, while privileged class drew large revenues by exploiting Chinese colonization. On the whole, however, immigration of Chinese and partial displacement of Mongol pastoral economy by Chinese agricultural economy were as favorable to Mongols as any such radical change could be to any people. Even where Mongols were being assimilated by the Chinese, process was easy and gradual enough to give them adequate time for adaptation. Mongols nowhere felt that they were being swept out by Chinese immigration. The majority of them, even within the field of Chinese penetration, were able to retain their language and racial identity. Their feeling of solidarity and prestige reflected on them by their own independent princes were fortified by class consciousness of being superior race, lords of the land entitled to tribal subsidies in the form of rentals from the Chinese. There was still a definite Mongol demand for Chinese immigrants, although majority of profit came into the hands of limited group among Mongols.